Today on Education Forum. Teacher evaluation. Who benefits? Welcome, I'm Jeff Conklin. This is the Education Forum. On today's show, we're going to be talking about teacher evaluation, pay for performance, and merit pay. It's a hot topic. The president's talked about it. Our governor recently made a statement about it, and that's where we're going to start today. But first, let me introduce my panel. To the right of me, I have Dr. Gary Shoup. He is an associate professor of educational leadership and a former principal. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you, Jeff.
Also with me today, and my co-host, Dr. Greg Blaylock, Assistant Professor of Special Education here at Columbus State University.
Thanks, Jeff.
Now that we've met our panel, I think we should show a little clip of our governor, Sonny Perdue, that was aired earlier this month.
Very much money unless they have a master's or doctorate degree. Well, this morning, Governor Sonny Perdue said he wants to change that. CBS Atlanta's Rebecca Schramm is live at the state capitol in downtown Atlanta with more on this story. Rebecca?
Yeah, Tracy, in a recent survey, 80% of Georgia teachers said they think they should be paid based on how well their students are doing in the classroom. The governor says he agrees.
I believe that our best teachers should be eligible for the same kind of pay our state champion football coaches receive. I think those ideas make sense to most Georgians.
At the annual Eggs and Issues breakfast, sponsored by the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, Governor Sonny Perdue said he'll introduce legislation this session that rewards teachers by paying them not just based on how many degrees they have, but also based on how their students are performing in the classroom.
Why should we continue to tell our best classroom teachers they must leave what they love and what they do best in order to compete economically with their peers? It's not right.
Governor Perdue said his bill won't call for doing away with the current teacher pay structure, but it would allow teachers to opt in to the new performance-based pay structure. If lawmakers approve the plan, Perdue says it will take a couple of years before the change will go into effect. For now, teachers and others whose paychecks come from the state could very well see more furlough days coming as lawmakers grapple with how to balance this year's state budget.
While our education will not have all the funding that we want to put in there, it doesn't suffer the same degree of funding that deficits that we have in other places.
So, what do teachers think about the governor's plan to allow them to change their pay structure if they wish? We'll have that part of the story coming up today at 4.
You know, it's interesting to note that the current pay system for teachers was originally designed in 1921, and we have been calling for a change in that system ever since. A recent meeting of the National Governors Association, they discussed how this will be on the agenda for most states for at least the next couple of years. But I think that sets the stage a little bit. I'd like to go to my guest now to take this discussion a little further. Gary, what are your thoughts about teacher evaluation and the current process that we're using?
I think that the current process is in Georgia, it's called the Georgia Teacher Observation Instrument. It's pretty efficient in regard to just allowing teachers to be assessed on their current level of teaching practices and what's going on in the classroom. It's a direct observation from the principal or the administrator to go into the classroom and observe the teacher for 20 to 30 minutes in a year. And that might be a little under expectations, but majority of good principals are going into schools throughout the year, not just on a 30-minute basis once a year. They go into classrooms quite often just to keep an eye on what's going on, to assess the teacher and student learning.
Okay. Now, having been a principal, how many teachers were you supervising or evaluating at your school?
Well, I ran a middle school, and most of the time we had anywhere from 75 to 85 teachers that had to be evaluated. A lot of times I would split the evaluation responsibilities up between myself and my assistant principal, and by doing that it was pretty manageable, but you had to begin almost in September and try to get them done at least by the end of March. And so I tried to pace myself and make sure it was going pretty good, because you can't do them in 1 month.
Sure.
So it's very important that you stagger them out throughout the year. And so unfortunately, the bad thing about that is sometimes when a teacher is observed in October, then they're thinking, well, maybe I don't have to worry about it and the pressure's off. But I don't think the majority of teachers would slack up or anything. I didn't worry about that. They always knew I was going to come in anytime anyway, even after the evaluation, so it wasn't just a one-time thing. It's a continuous process for most teachers.
Now, I think I heard you say it's about a 30-minute process when you do an evaluation, so it's a snapshot of what they're doing at that time. And you did, what, 50 teachers yourself, maybe?
Yes, I usually did about 50 teachers, or anywhere from 50 to maybe 55 of the academic teachers, the core subject areas. I then allowed my assistant principals that were learning the process, they did more of the courses such as connection classes, art, music, PE, and some other areas that were not strictly academic per se, but they did those, and they helped me out a lot. And so that's how we tried to manage it.
Now the forms that you were using, that was a form that came down from the state of Georgia?
That is correct.
Okay. And were you trained to do that? Did you go through a training on evaluating teachers?
Yes, absolutely. Matter of fact, all the principals or administrators who are going to be in charge of training, in charge of evaluating, or go through a type of training on how to use the instrument, what to look for.
Okay.
And teachers who are going to be evaluated on the instrument are also given training on what is going to be looked for by the principals or the assistants whenever they come in to observe them during that official observation.
Bottom line, did you like the system?
Yeah, I liked it. I liked it because I could provide good feedback to the teachers, telling them what they did and what was positive about it.
Okay.
And if I saw any weaknesses, I would try to help them privately with that. At the post-conference, we would conduct a post-interview conference, and I would share some things that I thought they could improve on. Occasionally, I would try not to be hard on them, but I would try to work with them if they had areas of improvement. I would suggest things, because I rarely came across someone that just really was sorry or a terrible teacher. That just they wouldn't be hired.
Sure.
Those type. Now, sometimes you have people that have bad days, and sometimes we can allow them to, hey, maybe I need to come back at a different time. Unfortunately, we don't like bad days because students don't get another replay, but the teachers, we just try to, instead of trying to crucify them, we would try to work with them and try to help them improve.
Now, it's pretty subjective, though. Was there like a numerical measure when you were doing this, or is it strictly, your narrative, your observations?
It was based on my observations, Jeff, but it was mostly regarding standards that we were looking for and things that we were hoping to find in the evaluation instrument itself. It was usually satisfactory, needs improvement, or unsatisfactory.
Okay.
Those were the three areas. No one got excellence. That wasn't a part of the evaluation. It was just satisfactory and unsatisfactory or needs improvement were the three categories that were used. And that's how all of them were for a while. And they've revised it a little bit throughout the years, but I think it's now those three categories.
Now, when you had a teacher that needs improvement or wasn't, making the standard, you had to go back in and reevaluate them.
Yes, I could, and I did. And
All right.
usually I would sometimes write a professional development plan that would show them. They would have to go to a course or take an extra session at a staff development program that I would recommend. It's called professional development plans.
Sure.
Teachers didn't always like to be placed on a professional development plan, but sometimes that's what we had to do in order to help them improve and to document any areas that might be weaknesses for the future if they don't improve.
Okay. So it sounds like you were happy with that system.
I was pretty much happy with it. I don't think it was anything related to the new programs that are coming out now. It was sufficient for what it was doing, I thought.
Okay.
For the most part, most principals know who their weak teachers are, and then you begin to work with them. As a good principal, you would work with them as much as you possibly could to try to help them or place them in a position where they can grow and work with another teacher that was very exceptionally well versed in pedagogy and how to do those kind of things, and you try to help them as best you can to become better and better. And we just rather try to take the ones that we've invested money in and try to help them and develop their skills as best we possibly can.
Sure. Now, what about those teachers that just didn't make the grade? Was that the same evaluation you'd use in the same professional development plan to move them out the door?
Well, yeah, you would set up a professional development plan that would be very difficult content for them to meet. But they had, if they're that poor, then you've really got to ramp it up a little bit to make sure that they meet the criteria that you expect for them. And sometimes they would not want to, or they would prefer to move on to another career.
Okay.
And that would be better for the students in the long run. So that's the way it goes. But applying pressure from that point that say you will improve, or it's going to reflect on your promotion and possible retention in this program.
Sure.
And so most of the teachers would rise to the occasion. Rarely would someone just not have the ability to do anything but and just back off of it. But sometimes that happens.
Okay. So it was a fairly effective system then. Now, Greg, you've done teacher evaluation before.
I have.
You've sat down and you've done that for a number of years. What are your thoughts on the evaluation system as it currently is?
Well, it's interesting to hear you talk about how it worked here in Georgia when you were a principal, Gary. I hear you say a couple of things that are key and they're interesting to me. You were satisfied with that system, and one of the things that I heard you say is that most principals know who their good teachers are and know who their teachers that need help are. And so one of my questions with that is, how do most principals know that? It sounds like it might be just sort of a feeling. A principal kind of gets to know his or her teachers, but what's the data behind that? And part of what's difficult about traditional evaluation systems, at least as we see them across the United States, is they're based on very often one-shot observations where an administrator, principal, or vice principal will come in and do an observation. They'll use some sort of observation rubric and tick some things off. And then, as you said, Gary, if it's a bad day, then we'll talk about that bad day in the post-observation conference and perhaps come back in the classroom and watch them again. But to the point, for me, is a system like that useful enough to make pay decisions on? In other words, one of my questions would be, Gary, would you feel comfortable in a system like that with the added layer of, now based on these evaluations for this year, as principal, this is how I'm going to dole out pay increases or significant pay bonuses? I'm curious as to how you see that might complicate something for you as an administrator.
Yeah, I can understand that. I think it would be, it would add a lot more to the mix, because whenever we go in to do observations, I know that teacher, and it's hard to be subjective.
Sure it is.
And to say, and not rule out all the other things that teacher might do to help that school or that classroom and all the extracurricular things that teacher's involved in, and is a very valuable employee. And so to say, to go in there and just say, hey, I'm just going to rule out all that and just be very subjective or objective and just look at just what I'm looking for. We do that, but I'm human and they're human, and there could be bias in that instrument, and I think that's unfortunate. There may be researcher biased in lots of different instruments, and how do you keep that out? It's going to be difficult, and it's going to be it has to be a very strong instrument. For what it was created to do, I think the GTOI, the Georgia Teacher Evaluation Instrument, was sufficient for its purpose. and that was to use it to help teachers gain better pedagogy skills, but also to identify weaknesses and then focus on those weaknesses as well.
Well,
And
and that's a good system. But what it tells you, and I think your question's right on, Greg, could you really make pay decisions based on that? And wouldn't we be better off if we had some numerical measure?
Absolutely.
And I just want to take one other thing. You never, maybe never is a strong word, but did you look at student performance, or were you looking at your observations?
The GTOI is based only on observations of what's
Okay.
going on in the classroom.
Good.
Outside data of how that teacher or how that teacher's students were performing on a standardized test was not involved.
Okay. Good.
And see, and there's a key issue here, and Gary, you said this a couple times. You talked about for its purpose, this system worked quite well, and I think that's the important piece here.
Okay.
We have to look at the purpose of evaluation. We have to look at the purposes that we might have a system in place for. And Gary, you described a system that had specific purposes to help teachers, to help figure out what teachers could improve upon, to help figure out perhaps what teachers might really be needing help on. But it wasn't designed to evaluate teachers in terms of differentiating those that are quote unquote better, and we're going to leave what we mean by better to the side for now. And so when we start talking about performance pay or merit pay, the key here is deciding how we are going to evaluate teachers. And I think if you look at the data on how we evaluate teachers, what's going to be important in the data is what the purposes for the evaluation system are. And simply taking what we currently have and saying, okay, now we're going to evaluate teachers based on current evaluation systems we have, I think is not playing into the purposes
Sure.
of our current evaluation systems. And I think that's the key when we start talking performance pay.
Yes.
Looking at creating evaluation systems that are based on one of the primary purposes being teacher pay.
Well, you know, it's funny because I remember watching you and looking at your reports when you've done teacher evaluations, Greg, and very detailed, very subjective. How do you feel about basing pay on that system that you had used before?
Well, and that's the difficult piece. You know, Gary's right on when he talks about subjectivity. It's going to enter into any kind of observational type thing. We'll use a rubric to try to make the subjective a little more objective.
Okay.
But there's still, you've got the bias coming in of subjectivity, and certainly what I value when I watch a teacher, whether it's teacher teaching math or teaching literature, or watch a teacher teaching self-help skills in a special education environment, may be different from what Gary or what you might value, Jeff.
Right.
And so I think the key here is, just as in research, one of the keys to offsetting bias is taking multiple data points.
Sure. Okay.
Looking at an issue from multiple lenses. And so when we start talking about teacher evaluation, I think now we need to really seriously consider multi-component evaluation. That is, evaluations that are not only based on an administrator observation, but are also based on perhaps peer reviews, and notice I said reviews and not a single review, that are based upon teacher objectives for that year, that perhaps could be based on even student achievement, however we decide to measure it. But I think what's important here is that we just don't take one thing, whether it's our current system of evaluation based on an observation, or whether it's the very popular way of evaluating just about anything in schools right now, which is student achievement. And of course, we measure achievement through a series of test scores, which may or may not be a valid way of measuring achievement. I guess it depends on how we define achievement.
Sure.
But we don't take what we currently have in place and just at a convenience say, okay, now we are going to judge teachers and judge what teachers should be making based on that.
Well, I think this is a good place to take a break. I got a question I want to bring up for Gary, but we'll do that right after the break. You're watching the Education Forum.
watching live streaming from the College of Education and Health Professions.
COEHP-TV brings you programming from the faculty, students, and staff in the College of Education and Health Professions. Learn more about our programs, admissions, initiatives, and other informative events by tuning to our webcast presented live from the studio located in Jordan Hall. Stay tuned for live classroom streaming coming soon on COEHP-TV.
We're back on the Education Forum with my guests, Dr. Gary Shoup and Dr. Greg Blaylock, and we're discussing teacher evaluation. Before we went to the break, I was going to ask Gary a question about his professional judgment, and isn't that an important aspect of evaluation, and shouldn't we trust someone's professional judgment?
Absolutely, I think so. As principals, we've been trained, we've gone through higher levels of education, and we've been placed in that position by a panel or by a group of people that have chosen us as ones to represent that school and to be in charge of that school. So I would hope that our professional judgment would be held in high esteem, and that when we walk into a classroom, we're doing the best job that we can and what we were trained to do. So that's my point about the evaluation instrument. It's only going to be as good as the person, but I believe the people that are doing this are quality individuals, and they have great character.
Okay. Well, I think the important aspect here is that we're professionals in education, and we need to be treated as such, and that should be accepted. What I want to talk about, though, now is, this is very subjective, and if we're going to be talking about money, we really need to get serious about evaluation. We need to add in the component of student achievement, because, the rest of this stuff doesn't matter. What matters is how students are doing.
That's true.
I think
absolutely. I think, though, an important piece of this is, certainly we want students to do better. I'm not sure, number one, we know what better means, or that we agree on what better means. Number two, I'm not sure we agree on how to measure what better is. Currently, in the last decade, we have a system in place where we try to measure what students, what we call achievement, is through a series of state exams that students go through. And I can tell you that teachers don't necessarily agree that that's the way to measure student achievement. It's politically useful, it's economically very useful to do, but is it really a valid measure of how students are doing? But more to the point, when you start talking about performance-based pay or merit-based pay, I think it's important to look at some underlying assumptions there. And, Donald Gratz wrote a great piece for the Education Leadership Journal this last year that just asked a couple of important questions. And one of the questions he addressed was what are the underlying assumptions to performance-based pay for teachers? Now, if we're assuming that we create a performance-based system, and as such we are going to improve student achievement, then one of the assumptions there might be that if you increase a teacher's pay, that teacher will be more motivated to teach students in a way that students should be taught. Sure. In other words, the idea that a teacher has the instructional skills, the pedagogical skills, but they're holding back a little bit. And if you just give them more money, then they'll be more willing to not hold back so much and to instruct their students. But teachers don't work that way. I don't know any teachers that are holding back because they're not making enough money. Teachers I know are working day and night and working on weekends, and not because of money, but because not only do they want to see their students achieve, but they also have administrative pressures over them to try to show student achievement in a certain way. And so if you just think that paying teachers more is going to increase student achievement because teachers are going to work harder, I think that's an assumption that we need to discuss.
But I think that's an important assumption that the current system is looking at. They're saying, if we give teachers more money, we're going to have better performance, and if that doesn't work, we have the wrong people in teacher education. We really need people that go towards that carrot to avoid that stick.
Absolutely, absolutely, and you know, teacher pay is important. I mean, we have to attract quality candidates.
No question about
to go
that.
into teaching to begin with. So we definitely have to look at what we're paying teachers just in general. Are we paying teachers a professional salary? If we're going to expect teachers to be professionals, are we paying them a professional salary?
Well,
but
that's a good issue too, because you know, should it just simply be merit pay, or should we pay them a professional salary? Gary, you know, you're the one that's training principals and superintendents, so you know, what do you think about that?
Well, you know, I kind of look at it from a philosophical point of view, in that fact that you know, how do we view our employees? Do we view them as they're sneaks and they try to get away with as little as possible, and they try to run, and they're only going to do the bare minimum? And that's kind of like the X and Y type of management approach or leadership approach.
Certainly.
And if we look for if we're going to try to analyze everything a teacher does and try to say, well, she's only doing this so that she can, or he can just get by with just the least little bit, then that's a different type of leadership approach.
Sure
but
is.
if we think that, hey, these teachers are coming here because, like you were saying, Greg, because this is their calling, this is what they feel that they've been led to do, and they want to be this servant leadership attitude toward the community and toward the students that they teach, then a lot of the ones that feel that way are thinking, I'm doing this because of my desire and my compassion for human beings, and I'm doing it because of that.
Sure.
Yeah, if you want to throw in some extra pay for my hard work, then I appreciate that. But majority of the time, I find that I can become a very negative individual if I look at all the other people that aren't working as hard as me and start getting mad about that.
Good.
It starts bringing me down.
Sure.
And I don't want that in my school. I want everybody to say, hey, pull your weight, do your part. And if I develop a contract with my teachers at the beginning of the year and say, this is what I want you to do, and if they fulfill that contract, then I'm going to offer them another one. If they don't fulfill that contract, then maybe I need to withhold it and say, I'm sorry, but you didn't do what you said you were going to do.
Sure.
And I would love to have an evaluation instrument that would help me do that. But like you said, Greg, I think the pay needs to be there for them, to support them for their compassion and their work that they're doing, because they have to live in this world too, and they have to make a living, and we need to give them that support because the job they're doing is quite incredible and it's very important. We're talking about the human capital of our nation put in the hands of these individuals, and so that is probably our greatest asset, our greatest natural resource is our people of the United States.
Right.
And how we support them and how we bring these children up for our future is going to be critical. And so to go and reduce it to a business model, to me, is a little bit, I don't know if we call it a slap in the face to these people that have said, hey, I'm giving my life for this. And now, by the way, we're going to pay you that little extra if the kids improve. Well, that's my goal all along, is for them to improve.
It's to hold them back, and then we'll just do it. But you know, I was listening to one of those conservative radio shows just this week, and they were talking about teacher evaluation. And one of the key points is we really need to look at the people that are in teacher education and say, you know, you could do a better job. That money should be the motivator. Money should be what it's all about. It shouldn't be that you love the work and you love the children. But the important thing is people that will perform and will reward them if they do. That, again, it's that business model that you just mentioned. And remember, in America, the business model is the model.
Absolutely. It's important to keep in mind, however, that if you're gonna look at it from a business model point of view, that you do the same thing that businesses do. A good business isn't a good business simply because it attracts talented people through higher pay.
Okay.
A good business looks at all aspects of working in that environment. And so a good business typically not only looks at their pay structure, but they look at their working environment. Sure. They look at how they empower their employees to take risks, how they reward their employees for taking risks, how they empower their employees to do their job, how they take some of the bureaucratic weight off of their employees so that employees feel free enough to do their work. And if you look at schools, if you look at polling among teachers, if you look at polling among administrators, you'll see that teacher pay is not the only thing that teachers are responding to. In fact, teachers are much more interested in working in schools and working in a field that empowers them to do their job.
You know, and many authors have written about that. I've just read something recently by Alfie Kohn was saying that exact same thing, that the motivation of teachers is to perform. But again, if we're looking at that business model, we have to remember one thing, and that is we do not get to pick and choose who comes into our classroom. We have to teach everybody. And in business, you're not that same way. I mean, you can pick and choose your audience and your customers and your product line. Everybody coming down the pike's coming in the door.
Absolutely. And so so it's politically very useful to talk about running schools like businesses, because as you said, a business model is something that most of us Americans, most of us voting Americans have a schema for, have an understanding of. And so it's politically very useful to talk about running schools like businesses, but in reality it's not useful at all because schools are very different, because we're talking about human capital, because we're talking about not being able to choose what our raw resources are going to be, not being able to choose where we're going to even place our place of business, where we're going to put our place of business. And so going beyond just the surface can tell you that a business model doesn't work in schools. Not to say that performance-based pay has no place in education. Mm-hmm. The devil is in the details, and I think this is the kind of discourse we need to have, is what do we mean by performance with teachers?
Now, I want to go back to Gary once again, because he's the one that's really preparing the people that are going to be doing those evaluations, and the people that are in those trenches that, we're the ones that are training the teachers that will be evaluated by your folks. So, I think it's important that you talk about some of those variables that aren't included right now in the evaluation that will make a difference.
I'm not totally against pay for performance as long as it can be done in an equitable and fair manner. Mm-hmm. And to me, I think it's going to become a bureaucratic nightmare of monumental proportions that for someone to make this work and where it's fair to everyone. I was thinking about this the other day. If it's going to be based on student test scores, then what would stop a teacher from going to the principal and say, by the way, I need so-and-so out of my classroom because our personalities are clashing. Sure. And I would like you to remove Joe out of there. Mm-hmm. And so if the principal removes them out and the teacher gets the extra bonus, but the teacher who got Joe didn't get it, now here we are as principals and administrators having to deal with that conflict. Well, I didn't get the pay performance because you sent Joe into my classroom because she didn't want him, and now he's got him, and that's not fair to me. And how are we going to justify all those things? So to me, it's going to open up a lot of can of worms that we haven't realized yet. Now, there are some states that are implementing merit pay performance type of programs. I think Denver, Colorado's got one. Texas has been into it for a while. I think the STAR program in Florida has its merits, but it's also being revamped and revised. It's more of an experimental phase right now, and I think Georgia is getting ready to move into this one, and they're getting ready to try some different things. But I was thinking about it again, that we're saying that if a teacher, and like you were saying, Greg, doesn't say, hey, I'm not in this for the money. I mean, I like the money that I'm getting, but an extra $3,000 or $4,000, I'm not going to necessarily do any. I don't know what else more I can do than what I'm doing already. I've done everything I possibly can do. How am I going to raise the bar for myself and make them learn any more than they already have? If a teacher has been dedicated and has given everything they possibly can, and there's outside variables that are coming into play, such as student attendance and parental factors and what's going on in the home, and what is that student bringing to the table, I'm going to be very selective. If I could choose my own classroom, wow, I would love to do that. But these kids are coming with all kinds of issues, and the parents are sending the best they possibly can. But I've got to take them from point A to point B, and if anything outside influences that, and I'm going to be basing it on my students' test scores, a lot of it, at least 50% of it, then I'm going to narrow the curriculum as much as I possibly can, keep out any type of extracurricular things that might be fun or innovative. And no, we're going to drill and we're going to practice, and you're going to pass this test, and you're going to do very well on it. And let's get this going. Work harder. Work harder. Wow. Were schools created for that? I mean, we can we can keep holding the carrot out there for the teachers, but how much more can they keep putting forth and harder and working harder and trying to reach that carrot? I don't know. I think some of them are pulling their hair out now, saying we've tried everything we possibly can try. What else can we do? Well, so I don't know.
You know, that begs the question: who benefits if we do that? You know, do the students really benefit if all you're doing is drill and practice, and we take the fun out, and we take out, you know, all the specials that go along with it?
Well, that's a good question. There's more to education than just the curriculum. The curriculum is the guiding principle behind it, or at least one of the guiding underlying things that we have to have. But in regard to what else does an education provide? It's a democratic type of process where a child is learning democracy and how to function in a society and to learn how to deal with other students and solve problems that are not even on a standardized test. We can teach students how to answer short questions, but are we teaching them how to do higher order thinking skills? Which businesses are saying this is something that we really want. We really want our students, our workers to come to us, and our employees to come, and our team members to come that have the ability to think creatively and think outside the box. Well, how do you test that on a standardized test?
Right.
I don't know.
You know, and I think you brought up a key point here, and that is, what do we really want out of education? Do we want to, you know, turn out good citizens that are part of democracy? Do we want people that are employable? Do we want to make more cogs for the machine? Do we want to indoctrinate people in the system? I always wonder, what do we want out of education?
Well, and that's where discussions around performance-based pay, I think that's where these types of discussions, or why they're important, because it gets some of these questions in the public discourse, or hopefully it will. Questions like, what is the purpose of education overall? And it's through these types of discussions then that I think communities can then better make decisions around the types of schools they want, and thus the types of teachers they want. You know, Gary, you said a couple of things that I clued into. Number one, the idea of if you base salaries on teacher performance, and if you connect teacher performance directly to student achievement as we currently measure it through test scores, then what you're doing is setting up a competitive system in schools where teachers are going to vie for certain types of students, and they're going to want to push out other types of students out of their classroom. So now, as I would imagine, as a school principal, you're having to deal with a teaching environment where your teachers are competing literally with one another. I'm not sure that's what we want in schools. We know from research that some of our best outcomes for students come from schools where teachers are collaborating, where teachers are working together on professional development teams, where teachers are teaching together. So if we go to a performance-based system, we have to make sure that however we decide to evaluate performance, we look at pieces that will promote collaboration and reduce our tendency to compete as teachers.
I got to stop you right there, because we're going to have to take a break. Because I mean, we could really roll with this one, but we're to the point we need to take another break. So we'll be back right after this. You're watching the Education Forum. back on the Education Forum. I'm Jeff Conklin, here with my panelists, Dr. Gary Shoup and Dr. Greg Blaylock, and we're discussing teacher evaluation. Before we went to the break, Greg was in the middle of a two-part question, and Greg, why don't you finish off? I'm sorry I interrupted you.
That's okay. You know, I was just jumping on the back of what Gary was talking about, and I was just trying to get us to consider a couple of things around performance-based pay. And the idea of connecting performance-based pay to student achievement as we currently measure it through student test scores. And just before we went to break, I tried to problematize the idea of how that might affect teacher collaboration within a particular school by setting up perhaps competition in schools for more desirable students and less desirable students. But then the second issue, and Jeff, I think you hit on this, Gary, you hit on this briefly, and it's the idea of getting back to the purpose of education. If we're going to continue to base our judgment of success in schools, whether it's our success in terms of teacher performance or our success in terms of our curriculum, if we're going to continue to judge that on student achievement as we currently measure it through student test scores primarily, then what we're doing is we're teaching students certain behaviors and certain types of knowledge that we know businesses are not looking for.
Right.
Businesses are looking for individuals who can problem solve, who can critically think, who are collaborative, who understand how to work on teams. Among other things. We know that's what businesses are looking for, yet those are the very things that we don't do a very good job of looking at in schools. If we're not going to look at that in schools, then are we going to be motivated to teach that in schools? And so whatever performance-based pay we're looking for, we have to make sure we consider other aspects to student achievement than just test scores.
Well, I think that the performance-based pay, if it's going to be based 50% on student performance on standardized test scores, then we really need to make sure that the test is valid and reliable. And I mentioned that earlier because in the past we've had a little bit of problem with the test that's been created in Georgia being thrown out after a year, and the test scores came back and they were awful, and they said, wow, the test is not valid. Well, here we are now getting ready to start a pay-for-performance program based on a test that might have a little bit of shakiness to it. I hope that they will iron out those problems and make sure it's all working in good order and that it is reliable and valid and can be an instrument that can be useful in determining that, if that's what the determination is going to be. The other thing that bothers me a little bit about using a standardized test score is I'm thinking this test was put together by a group of people that determined that they were test makers, and they determined that this test is going to measure success. So therefore, they become the ultimate expert in saying, well, we know whether you're successful or not based on how well you did on this test. So they're determining what student success is based on their passage of this test or not. I don't think a student being successful would be based on a standardized test all the time. We have hundreds of examples of people that didn't do well on tests and yet were very successful in life. And so to say that they're not successful, I don't think is what they're trying. I hope they're not trying to do that, but they are going to have to use it as some type of measurement tool, and that's going to be the instrument of choice. I'm supposing it's going to be the criterion reference test that's used in the state of Georgia.
But see, and that's I think what we have to discuss as a state. We have to discuss it as a nation, certainly, but the idea of basing teacher performance on student performance on tests. Let's just go beyond the validity issue of our current tests, and let's consider the fact that a large percentage of our teachers, close to half of our teachers in schools, teach subjects that have nothing to do with these tests. So how are you going to base their performance if you're basing it primarily on student test scores? How are we also have to know history and learn from history. And over the last 100 years or 80 years, 90 years since we went to a pay step scale for teachers, we've tried several times to go to merit-based systems that are based on student achievement on test scores, and each time those have failed miserably. Why they failed miserably? Well, for many of the reasons that we've just talked about this morning.
You know, and I think you're bringing up an excellent point when we look at the new plan by the president of the Race to the Top, and in the $4 billion program that he's put together. And I think we have to look at what are the implications of this. We've talked about the teacher in the classroom, but what about the principals? What about the superintendents? What about those of us in colleges of education?
That has some great implications in it as well, is because one of the things I've heard is that and the argument is, why should we pay people for their advanced degrees whenever they really make no difference in student academic performance? At least that's what the research is coming to. So they're basically saying, we're not going to pay you any longer on whether you have a master's degree or a specialist degree or a doctorate degree. We're going to pay teachers on how well their students perform.
Yes.
And so that becomes the basis for the pay increases that anyone might get. So it might discourage people from saying, well, why do I need to go get a master's degree? Unfortunately, people don't look past the implications of that, because most of our students that are involved in our college classes here, they share with me how much they have learned just from the collaboration with the professors and the collaboration with other students about what's going on in the field of education, what are the new things that's happening, what kinds of strategies are being implemented, what are the best practices that are being used, what is research saying. If you're a teacher that's just stuck alone in your classroom and you're just working on trying to improve student performance based on your own experiences and don't listen to outside knowledge that might be new in the field, then you're really limiting your career and your expertise to develop your craft in a better way. And I think that's important, that teachers don't stop expanding their knowledge by dropping their advanced degrees, or at least not pursuing an advanced degree, because I think to me, that makes you a better rounded person and
Certainly.
a better teacher. And a better administrator, because you've gained expertise from other people, and you've learning what the research says. You're involved in reading articles and getting more involved in developing your intellectual capacity.
You bring up such an excellent point there, because I personally would want a teacher that went back to school, that picked up a master's degree, that picked up a ed leadership degree, that was trying to improve their skills and their knowledge base. I think that's the kind of teachers we want. But I think we've really got to talk about, what is this going to mean? Let's look at what happened in Rhode Island just last week, where they terminated all the teachers in the school and the principal, and we're going to have a clean slate and start again. Is this the future?
Well, the latest thing I've heard is that they're now reconsidering the firing of all those teachers, and now they're looking back at, well, maybe we acted too quickly and we need to go back and find out if there's anybody that was in there that should not have gotten fired. And so they're renegotiating that with some of the teacher unions that are involved, because they were very upset about that, and of course that's created a brouhaha with them.
Of course. Well, and thank goodness we have the union there, because if we didn't have the union, we probably wouldn't be even having that part of the dialogue. But I mean, this does impact us in our field. It impacts us in the universities and the colleges, and I think we ought to make some,
Well, yeah, it certainly does. It comes back to a discussion that you and I have had, Jeff, quite often, and it's an overt discussion that I have in my classes. Perhaps many other professors do too. And it gets back to what, Gary, you were talking about in terms of perhaps what students might come to a university to get, such as CSU. Are they coming to the university to just get more pay? Well, certainly that's a piece of it right now. But ultimately, what else are they getting out of it? And one of the overt discussions we have in many of my classes is the idea that here at the university, you're not learning to just be a technician or a better technician.
Right.
We're not here to train teachers to put widgets together. But really, you come to a university such as CSU to learn to think, to learn to problem solve, to learn to take different pieces of data in a particular situation and make good decisions, make better decisions. That's why teachers would come to a university. That's why you would get into a graduate program, not to become a better technician, but to become a better thinker.
Well,
and so a lot of teachers don't understand or don't see or value that until they get into a program and start to realize, wow, I actually am becoming a better teacher, even if it doesn't translate into immediate test scores next year in math.
When you say that, though, I think the agenda here is maybe if we turned out better technicians, if we had people that were simply teaching to the test, simply trying to improve student performance on assessments, we'd be accomplishing our goal. And what concerns me is the talk is, in colleges of education, we're going to be judged on how our principals do and how our superintendents do with such things as AYP and student performance.
Yeah, and if again, you look at all the different variables that come into play, and if they're going to base a principal's performance based or pay performance based on his school's academic achievement, and then if they don't make it, then they're going to say, well, where did you get your advanced degree from? Well, then we're going to go back and decide whether we're going to give any your professors any extra bonuses as well. That seems very bureaucratic, in my opinion. I don't know how that would even play out. One thing that came up not too long ago, that I heard they were going to start focusing on the lowest 5%.
Right.
Now, if you think about that type of thought, that we're going to get rid of the lowest 5% of the schools. Okay, so now you've gotten rid of the lowest 5%. The next year, you're going to have another lowest 5%. And then you're going to always have a lowest 5%. Are you going to just keep firing the lowest 5% until everybody, when is the, because if you think about the way the percentages are, somebody's always going to be at the lowest 5%.
What a thought. Gee.
So it really doesn't make sense. I really have to, I need to go back and read all the stuff they're talking about whenever they talk about, whenever the governor says he wants the state to focus on the lowest 5% of the schools that are showing the lowest academic achievement. Well, okay, we can do that, but they're going to show up again next year. But they're not be the same schools, but they're going to be there. 5%.
Well,
back to that competition.
What concerns me, and it's an issue even in our town here, where you have an area in town where the schools just do a poor job on tests. I mean, their test scores are just abysmal. They're not making AYP. And, those are the schools that the experienced teachers, the teachers that are your good teachers, don't want to work in. So what do we end up with there? We end up with the new teachers or the teachers that have been there for 20 years and just were never quite there. But, we're going to continue to see this. I want to work over on the north end because then I'm in the good schools that have the money and the kids that are, able to do better.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think it's one of the most important things to keep in mind when you look at merit-based or performance-based pay systems is when you're putting together your system of evaluation for teachers, you have to take into consideration variables that affect hard-to-teach positions, that affect schools that are difficult to teach in, schools that have students that come in that don't have the skills, the preparation skills that some other schools have. You have to take into consideration even positions within any school that might be difficult. Teachers of special education, for instance, where by definition teachers are working with students who are very, very difficult to teach certain concepts and skills. That's not difficult because those students are bad students, but difficult simply because they have perhaps a disability of some sort. So whatever our performance-based system ends up being, it has to be very well thought out, or you are certainly going to see a couple of things. An increase in competition among teachers. Sure. You're going to see a continuation of the best teachers, the best and brightest teachers flying out of difficult to teach schools and difficult to teach students. Right. And you'll continue to see failing schools and failing students fail because they're not given the resources they need to become better students, to become better thinkers. And so when getting back to your initial question, what are the implications of this? The implications could be quite dire if we don't think through how we're going to evaluate teachers. Sure. It's very politically difficult to deal with this because in today's day and age, you get reelected through sound bites and easy to understand concepts. Teacher evaluation is not a quick, easy to understand concept.
If we had scores, maybe. But Gary,
one of the things that I think we might want to look at in the global idea is we might need to rethink our model of education. Back in the 40s, we had the piston-driven airplane. And the piston-driven airplane, this is based on a hypothesis called the upper level hypothesis by Dr. Brannon out of the Florida State University. And he was saying that he thinks that maybe schools perhaps have met the upper level of achievement that we can possibly get out of the current model that we use. And his idea was that, and he used the analogy of the piston-driven airplane in the fact that architects and designers began to work with this piston-driven airplane as best they could to try to create a plane that could have high speed, carry a big payload, and also have a long range. And they did everything they could to tweak the wings, to change the fuselage, to add more piston-driven engines onto that airplane as many as they possibly could.
Sure.
But they found out that when they got more speed, they lost payload. Or when they improved range, they lost speed.
Right.
So they played with it as much as they possibly could. Even Howard Hughes developed the Spruce Goose, which was a monumental airplane that could only fly maybe a foot off the ground, but it was huge and it could carry a lot, but it couldn't go anywhere.
And a lot of engines.
And so they finally said, we have reached the maximum that we can get out of the piston-driven airplane. There's nothing more left that we can get out of this model. And someone came up with a new model called the jet engine.
Yes.
And when they came up with a jet engine, the aeronautic industry skyrocketed and went vertical. Well, maybe perhaps it's time for us as thinkers to be thinking past the current model of education that we're in. Instead of trying to tweak it with pay performance or tweak it with No Child Left Behind or do it here and try to get a little bit more out of this piston-driven model, maybe we need a brand new model. And someone is going to come up with it.
Okay.
It's out there. It's beyond it. When the model that we currently have ceases to function and produce what we want it to produce, a new model is on the horizon and it's waiting to be discovered. And maybe that's where we're at this point. Maybe we're finally going to become exasperated with all the different kinds of strategies and little things that we can do to try to make teachers work harder and make students perform more. Maybe we need to just stop and say, hey, maybe there's a different model that we need to look at. Now, I don't know if we're at that point or not, but I hope so.
That's a great point. What I notice quite often is that's what your conservatives keep saying, and that is the system. It's a bad system. The experiment of public education is not working. It's time we came around to that. But what I think is we really have never laid out what we truly want, and if we don't know what we want, we're never going to get there. And I think that's an important thing. The other thing we have to look at is this. You can have it good, you can have it cheap, or you can have it quick. And what we always want in this country is cheap and quick, which is an election cycle. So we never get to good. And we never stay with anything long enough to see it come to fruition. We change it with every election. Every president comes in with his own plan. And so, again, do we know what we want?
I think that's an excellent point, Jeff. And of course, the short answer is, from my perspective, no, we don't. I think one of the important things that we no longer seem to discuss is how we measure student achievement. And I think, number one, we have to get back to that discussion as a state and as a nation, and see if there's other ways that might measure student achievement in a way that we're a little more satisfied with. Certainly teachers don't see it as a very valid way of measuring student achievement. Many administrators don't. Politicians do. It's quick and it's cheap.
Cheap. There you go. We fit right into that. Yeah, I think that's a good point.
So finally, I think what we want to end with, perhaps with something on a show like this, is the idea that if we look at performance-based pay for teachers, I think we need to really consider evaluating performance with multiple components. Currently, we don't do that. But I think it's the pieces of evaluation that we need to fully consider, whether it's observation, test scores, peer review, or what have you.
Well, I think we've run out of time, and I just wanted to let everyone know that that's the Education Forum for today. I'd like to thank my panelists, Dr. Gary Shoup, and my co-host, Greg Blaylock, and I'm Jeff Conklin, and this has been the Education Forum.